The date is August 27th, 1927. In a filthy, forgotten alley in Rio de Janeiro, detectives stand over a scene not of violence, but of absence. There is no body, no blood. There is only a small, hand-carved wooden bird lying discarded in the mud. A child's toy. The boy it belonged to, a 10-year-old newspaper seller named Mateus, had vanished without a trace 2 days earlier. He was the fourth boy to disappear in 6 months. The city was on the edge of panic, haunted by whispers of a shadow that carried a large burlap sack. The police were hunting a man. The public was terrified of a monster. They were both right. This is not the story of the Boogeyman you were told as a child. This is the story of the real-life serial killer who became him. Mateus was a child of the city. He was born not in a hospital, but in the sprawling, chaotic favela of Morro da Providencia, a vertical city of wood and tin overlooking the glittering promise of Rio de Janeiro. His world was one of noise, of struggle, and of a fierce, desperate love for his family. Every morning before the sun rose, he would run down the hill's winding staircases, his bare feet slapping against the cool stone, to collect his stack of the Jornal do Brasil. He was a newspaper boy, a small but vital gear in the great machine of the city. He knew the streets of the city center better than any policeman. He knew the rich bankers who would sneer and toss him a coin, and he knew the dock workers who would share a piece of bread and a kind word. His voice, shouting the day's headlines, was part of the city's soundtrack. But Mateus had a secret. In the pocket of his worn trousers, he kept 2 things: the small wooden bird his father had carved for him, and a tattered picture of an airplane he had cut from a magazine. He wasn't just selling papers to survive. He was saving them. Every coin he earned was a step closer to a dream of one day leaving the dirt and the noise behind, of flying high above the city that was slowly trying to swallow him. He was not just a victim. He was a boy with a plan, a boy who believed in a future. The Rio de Janeiro of the 1920s was a city at war with itself. It was the Belle Epoque tropical, a dazzling capital of immense wealth, Parisian architecture, and extravagant parties. Electric trams hummed along the elegant Avenida Rio Branco, while the rich and powerful gathered at the Grand Teatro Municipal. It was a city desperate to present itself to the world as a beacon of modernity and European sophistication. But this was a facade. Just beyond the glow of the gas lamps lay another Rio, a city of sprawling slums, of crushing poverty, of dark, narrow streets where the police rarely ventured. It was a city of deep-seated mysticism, where the Catholic faith of the Portuguese mingled with the powerful African traditions of candomblé and umbanda. It was a world of whispers, of omens, of shadows that held more than just darkness. For the thousands of families living on the margins, the city was not a promise. It was a hunting ground. And in the late 1920s, a new and terrifying predator had begun to stalk that ground. August 25th was a hot, suffocating day. Mateus had sold almost all of his papers. He had made a good day's wage, and the dream of the airplane felt a little closer. He was making his final rounds in the Lapa district, an area of bohemians, artists, and shadows. He shouted his last headline, his voice tired but triumphant. As he turned to head home, a man stepped out from a narrow alleyway. He was tall, dressed in dark, respectable clothes. He smiled. He told Mateus he had left his wallet in his office and needed a paper, but could only pay with a larger bill. He asked the boy to follow him, just for a moment. It was a common enough request. But as Mateus stepped from the bustling street into the sudden, cool silence of the alley, a primal fear he had never felt before seized him. He saw the man's eyes, and they were not kind. He saw the large burlap sack the man held in his other hand. Mateus turned to run, but it was too late. A hand, strong as iron, clamped over his mouth. The world tilted. The sounds of the city, the trams, the voices, the life he knew, it all faded, muffled by the rough, suffocating fabric of the sack. In the struggle, the small wooden bird, his last connection to his father, his last symbol of hope, fell from his pocket and was pressed into the mud. 2 days later, Detective Alencar stood over that same small toy. He had seen the fear in the eyes of the other families. He knew this was not just another missing child. A pattern was emerging. A shadow was moving through his city, collecting its children. The investigation had just begun, but Alencar could feel it in his bones. He was not just hunting a man, he was hunting a myth in the making. The question was not just who did this, but what kind of monster were they dealing with? In the chaotic heart of the Rio de Janeiro police headquarters, Detective Alencar created what he called the Wall of the Lost. It was a grim map of the city, marked with the faces of the vanished boys. There was João, a fruit seller's assistant; Pedro, who shined shoes near the docks; Marcos, who ran errands for the merchants; and now Mateus, the newspaper boy. 4 faces, 4 lives erased. Alencar stared at the wall, and a chilling pattern began to solidify from the chaos. They were all boys between the ages of 8 and 13. All were meninos de rua, street kids, children of the invisible poor. They were the lifeblood of the city's informal economy, but in the eyes of the powerful, they were disposable. This was the killer's hunting ground. He was not targeting the sons of the rich. There were no ransom notes, no demands. This was not about money. This was about something far darker. The only evidence left at any of the scenes was a profound and terrifying absence. The press, smelling a story that could shake the city, descended like vultures. The early reports were cautious, speaking of a string of disappearances. But as the days turned into weeks with no news of Mateus, the tone shifted. The journalists began interviewing the terrified residents of the favelas, and in doing so, they unearthed something ancient. They unearthed a name. The old women, the grandmothers who had heard the stories from their own grandmothers, spoke in hushed tones of a dark figure who carried a burlap sack to steal away naughty children. The Homem do Saco. The newspapers, hungry for a headline, printed the legend. And in doing so, they gave their city's greatest monster his name. Alan Carr's investigation was now a race against time, not just to catch a man, but to stop a real-life killer from becoming a full-blown myth. The initial police response was predictable and flawed. They rounded up the usual suspects, the city's homeless, the beggars, the mentally ill who wandered the streets. Anyone who looked out of place or carried a sack was dragged in for questioning. It was a show of force designed to calm the public, but Alan Carr knew it was a waste of time. The abductions were too clean, too organized. The timing, the choice of location, the speed of the disappearance. This was the work of a predator who was intelligent, patient, and methodical. He was not a madman grabbing children at random. He was a hunter executing a plan. Witness interviews were a frustrating maze of contradictions. The fear and the legend had contaminated their memories. One person swore they saw a tall, thin man. Another described a short, heavy-set figure. His face was always obscured, hidden by the shadow of a hat or the darkness of an alley. The only detail that remained consistent, the one element that burned in every witness's mind, was the sack. It became the killer's sigil, a horrifying symbol of his crimes. The police were no closer to finding the man, but the public now knew exactly what to fear. A dark figure, a burlap sack, and the children who were never seen again. Weeks turned into a month. The investigation hit a wall. No bodies had been found, which was perhaps the most terrifying part of the mystery. It created a sliver of hope for the families that was a special kind of torture, a hope that dwindled with every passing day. Alan Carr felt the case slipping through his fingers. The city's fear had curdled into anger, directed at the police force's incompetence. The name Homem do Saco was now on everyone's lips, whispered in nurseries and screamed in headlines. The killer had achieved a terrifying kind of immortality while he was still at large. The legend was now actively working against the investigation. False leads flooded the headquarters. A grocer carrying a sack of potatoes was nearly beaten by a mob. A man delivering mail was reported as a suspect. The city was hunting shadows, its paranoia fueled by the monster the newspapers had helped create. Alan Carr was no longer just a detective. He was a folklorist, forced to sift through the superstitions to find the hard facts. He knew the killer was a man of flesh and blood, but the city was now so terrified of the myth that they could no longer see the man. And the killer, cloaked in the legend he had inspired, was free to plan his next move. The break in the case came, as it so often does, from the killer's arrogance. A fifth child was taken. A 9-year-old shoe shiner named Tiago, a boy known for his fierce and stubborn spirit. On a cool September evening, he was cornered in an alley near the port. The man in the dark coat descended, the sack held open. But Tiago did not freeze. He fought, he kicked, he screamed, and as a hand clamped over his mouth, he bit down with all the force his small jaw could muster. He tasted blood. He was still overpowered, still thrown into the suffocating darkness of the sack, but he had left his mark. He had also been seen. Not clearly, but seen nonetheless. High above the alley, a laundress named Isabel was pulling in her washing from a line. She had heard a muffled scream and peered down into the gloom. She saw a struggle. She saw a boy being forced into a large, dark car, a luxury automobile, a Ford Model T, a vehicle of the rich, something as out of place in that poor, grimy alley as a diamond in a coal mine. In the darkness, she couldn't make out the full license plate, but she saw the first two letters, FZ. And she saw the car speed away, its expensive engine a quiet hum in the night. This was the revelation that changed everything. Detective Alencar stood on his office, staring at the wall of the lost, and a new, horrifying theory began to form. He had been looking in the wrong places. Everyone had. They were hunting in the gutters, in the favelas, among the poor and the outcast. But the evidence now pointed in the opposite direction. The killer was not one of them. He was one of the elite. A man of wealth and status, a man who could afford a luxury car and drive through the city without suspicion. A man hiding his monstrosity not in the shadows of an alley, but behind the pristine facade of high society. The Homem do Saco was not a beggar. He was a gentleman. Alencar now had his first real leads, a partial license plate, and the knowledge that somewhere in one of Rio de Janeiro's elegant mansions, a rich man was nursing a fresh wound on his hand. The myth was about to collide with a monster of flesh and blood. The hunt was finally on. The partial license plate was the key. Detective Alencar dedicated his entire, exhausted force to a single, monumental task: to cross-reference every Ford Model T registered in Rio de Janeiro with the initials FZ. The list was long, a who's who of the city's most powerful families: industrialists, politicians, coffee barons. It was a list of men who were considered untouchable. Alencar knew he was walking into a minefield. To accuse one of these men was to risk not just his career, but his life. The breakthrough came from an anonymous tip. A letter slipped under the door of the precinct in the dead of night, written in a neat, trembling hand. It was from a servant. It spoke of a man, a wealthy European immigrant who lived in a grand mansion in the Santa Teresa Hills. A man known for his strange, solitary habits and his quiet generosity to the local orphanages. A generosity that now seemed sinister. The servant wrote of his master's car, a black Ford Model T, and of the nights he would return late, his clothes stained with dirt, his hands often scratched and bruised. And the letter mentioned one more thing. The master had been complaining for a week about a painful, infected wound on his hand. A bite mark. The name on the letter was Fyodor Zhukov, a Russian émigré, a philanthropist, and the owner of a car with the license plate FZ14. Fyodor Zhukov was, on the surface, a pillar of the community. He was a refugee from the Bolshevik Revolution, a man who had supposedly lost his family and his fortune, only to rebuild his life in the vibrant chaos of Rio. He was known for his quiet, melancholic demeanor and his charitable donations. But behind the mask of the respectable gentleman was a soul twisted by a dark and horrifying obsession. Alencar, armed with the evidence of the bite and the car, secured a warrant and led the raid on Zhukov's mansion himself. What they found in the cellar of that opulent home was a scene from a nightmare. It was not a butcher's abattoir. It was a laboratory. Zukov was not a common murderer. He was a follower of a dark, fringe medical philosophy, a twisted offshoot of European occultism. He believed that the vital essence of the young, their elam vitale, could be used to treat his own chronic degenerative illness. He was not killing these children for pleasure or out of rage. He was harvesting them. He was using their life force in a grotesque and futile attempt to stave off his own death. The burlap sack was not just a tool for transport, it was part of his sickening ritual. He was reenacting the folklore of his own Russian homeland, the tales of the bagman who stole away children. In his warped mind, he was not a killer. He was a figure of myth, taking what was necessary. He confessed to everything, not with remorse, but with the cold, detached logic of a scientist explaining an experiment. He described how he would stalk the streets, looking for the perfect subjects, healthy, vibrant children whose life force was strong. He detailed the abductions, the cellar, and the horrifying procedures. He was the man from the headlines, the monster from the lullabies. He was the Homem do Saco. The arrest of Fyodor Zukov sent a shockwave through Rio de Janeiro. The idea that this monster, this child-hunting boogeyman, was not a resident of the favelas, but a member of the city's elite, was a truth more shocking than any legend. The press, which had built the myth of the Homem do Saco, now had the even bigger story of the real man. Zukov's face was plastered on every newspaper, his story a lurid tale of high society horror and occult madness. For the families of the lost boys, the arrest was not a moment of relief, but the beginning of a new and even more profound agony. Zukov, under interrogation, finally revealed the location where he had disposed of the bodies. In a desolate, swampy area west of the city, a mass grave was found. The small, broken forms of João, Pedro, Marcos, Mateos, and Tiago were unearthed. The city's hope, the last flickering ember that the boys might be alive, was extinguished. The search was over. The period of mourning had just begun. The city had found its monster, but in doing so, it had lost its children forever. The case against Fyodor Zukov seemed ironclad. There were the bodies, the confession, the evidence from his cellar, and the bite mark on his hand, a final damning piece of testimony from a boy who could no longer speak. The prosecution, led by a fiery young prosecutor named Barreto, was confident. This would be an open and shut case, a swift delivery of justice for a city baying for blood. But Zukov was not just any criminal. He was a man of means. From his jail cell, he hired the most expensive defense attorneys in Brazil. The confession, they argued, was coerced. The evidence was circumstantial. The servant's letter was the fabrication of a disgruntled employee. They began to build a new narrative, not of a monstrous killer, but of a sick, eccentric foreigner being scapegoated by a desperate police force and a hysterical public. They would argue that the police hadn't caught the Homem do Saco. They had simply put a rich man's face on a pre-existing myth. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate and horrify the entire nation. The battle for justice for the lost boys was about to begin, and it would be fought in a courtroom where the line between the man and the myth would be blurred forever. The trial of Fyodor Zhukov, which began in the spring of 1928, was more than a legal proceeding. It was a national spectacle. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, society matrons, and the grieving, stoic families of the victims. Outside, crowds gathered, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous fury. This was the trial of the Homem do Saco, and the entire country held its breath. Zhukov's defense team was brilliant and ruthless. They painted their client not as a predator, but as a victim of xenophobia and mass hysteria. They argued that the police, under immense public pressure, had zeroed in on the wealthy foreigner, the other, as an easy scapegoat. They attacked the credibility of every piece of evidence. The bite mark? A simple household accident. The car? He had lent it to a friend that evening. The servant? A liar seeking revenge. They expertly played on the jury's prejudices, suggesting that the police were too incompetent to catch the real killer, and so they had manufactured one. The prosecution, led by Barreto, fought back with pure, unadulterated horror. They brought in the detectives who had unearthed the small bodies from the swamp, their testimony painting a grim, unforgivable picture. They presented the chillingly detailed confession, which Zhukov now claimed was signed under duress. But the most powerful moment of the trial came when Barreto presented Exhibit A, a small mud-stained wooden bird. He placed it on the railing of the jury box. He told them the story of Mateos, the newspaper boy who dreamed of flying. He explained that this small toy was the boy's most prized possession, a symbol of a future he would never have. In that moment, the trial was no longer about a rich foreigner. It was about the stolen dreams of a child. The myth was silenced, and the human cost of the crimes filled the room. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The city and the nation waited. When they finally returned, the courtroom was deathly silent. Fyodor Zhukov stood, his face a mask of calm, aristocratic indifference. The foreman of the jury, a simple shopkeeper, his hands trembling, read the verdict. Guilty, on all counts of kidnapping and murder. A wave of raw, cathartic emotion swept through the courtroom. Mothers of the victims collapsed in tears. Outside, the crowd erupted in a roar that echoed through the streets of Rio. The judge, his face grim, delivered the sentence. In an era before the death penalty was abolished in Brazil, there was only one possible punishment for crimes of such monstrosity. Fyodor Zhukov was sentenced to death by firing squad. Justice, it seemed, had been served. The man who had hidden behind a myth was now condemned by the laws of men. For the families, the verdict was not a victory. It was a punctuation mark at the end of a chapter of unbearable pain. It could not bring back their sons. The city of Rio de Janeiro was forever changed. The case of the Homem do Saco had exposed a dark underbelly beneath its glamorous facade. It revealed the terrifying vulnerability of the city's poorest children and the monstrous evil that could fester in its highest echelons. The name Fyodor Zhukov would eventually fade from the headlines, a footnote in the annals of crime. But the name he had unwillingly embodied, the Homem do Saco, would not die. It was now more powerful than ever. The trial had taken a local superstition and broadcast it to the entire nation. It had confirmed every parent's worst fear. The Boogeyman was real. The legend had been given a face, a method, a name. And even after Zhukov was executed, the story continued. The myth had become a separate entity, a self-sustaining narrative virus. Now, when a child vanished or a strange man was seen near a school, the whisper would begin. O Homem do Saco. The real-life killer was gone, but the legend he had cemented was now immortal. This is how a myth is truly born. It is forged in the crucible of real human tragedy and fueled by our deepest collective fears. The legend of the Sackman was never just one man. It was the face given to 1,000 different fears. The fear of the stranger, the fear of the city, the fear of the rich and powerful preying on the weak. Fyodor Zhukov was not the first Homem do Saco, and he would not be the last. He was simply the one who was caught, the one who gave a horrifying, tangible form to a timeless nightmare. The story serves as a chilling reminder that our monsters are rarely born of pure fantasy. They are often exaggerated reflections of a real-world horror, a story we create to help us comprehend an evil that is otherwise too vast or too random to understand. We tell the story of the Sackman to our children as a warning, a simple tool to teach them about the dangers of the world. But in doing so, we also keep the memory of Mateus, of Tiago, and of all the other lost boys alive. They are the true faces behind the legend, the heartbreaking reality that gave birth to the myth. The Sackman may not be real, but the danger he represents always will be.